Imagine walking into your office tomorrow morning and your functional IQ is significantly lower than if you had just stayed up all night staring at a blank wall.
Right. And you haven't lost any actual intelligence. Your brain hasn't changed physically or anything.
Exactly. Your cognitive processor is just so completely maxed out by background noise that you're literally operating at a severe mental deficit.
You're totally prone to errors. Your impulse control is completely shot. And your ability to plan for the future is just non-existent.
Yeah. Now, pair that mental state with a financial environment where you voluntarily agree to take on a loan that compounds to a 90 million% annual interest rate,
Oh, wow.
and you just accept it as normal.
Well, the terrifying part of those two scenarios isn't that they happen to some, small, isolated group of people.
Mm,
The terrifying part is that under the right systemic
like
condition,
anyone would do it.
every single person listening to this right now
Yeah.
would make those exact same choices. I mean, the architecture of how we process scarcity basically guarantees it.
And that architecture, that invisible trap we fall into when we relentlessly try to optimize our lives and our organizations, that's exactly what we are dismantling today.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. If you're joining us, yes, you, the curious mind tuning in, we are thrilled to have you at the table.
Always glad to have you here.
Because today, our mission is to explore this fascinating, highly counterintuitive paradox that's hidden right inside our modern obsession with, productivity and efficiency.
Right.
We're looking at why the relentless pursuit of being lean and mean might actually be making you, your team, and your entire company fundamentally incapable of innovation. Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a huge stack of sources today.
We really
Okay.
do. To understand the cognitive side, we'll be looking through the lens of behavioral economics with Scarcity by Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir.
Great book.
Oh, it's incredible. And we're pairing that with the groundbreaking field research in poor economics by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo.
But we aren't just looking at the individual brain. We have to see how this scales up.
Right, the macro level.
So we're integrating the foundational systems theories from Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems and Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline.
Both absolute classics.
And finally, to understand how this impacts our ability to, actually build the future, we're layering in innovation and strategy frameworks from Tim Brown's Change by Design and Richard Rummelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy.
It's a massive intellectual landscape.
It really is. But the core investigation is pretty simple. We want to know why the feeling of not having enough completely rewires how we operate.
Yeah. And I think we need to unpack the foundational definition first. Because the way we casually use the word scarcity is actually, well, it's holding us back from understanding the actual problem.
How so?
Well, we tend to talk about scarcity purely as a math problem, or like a physical constraint in the external world.
Right, like I have a budget of $1,000, but my bills are $1,200.
Exactly. Or you have a project that takes 40 hours to complete, but you only have 24 hours in the day.
Right.
Treat it like it's just a calculation on a spreadsheet.
Just numbers.
Right. But the major breakthrough in the book Scarcity is this realization that scarcity is fundamentally a psychological state.
Okay.
It's a highly specific mindset that captures human cognition automatically and involuntarily.
The word involuntarily is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, I feel like. It implies you don't opt into this mindset.
You have zero conscious control over it. None. When you lack something essential, your mind is forcefully riveted by that unfulfilled need.
It just takes over.
Literally. You can look at the famous World War II starvation experiments they did in Minnesota.
Oh, right. I remember reading about this.
Yeah, the researchers took healthy young men and put them on these semi-starvation diets just to study the physiological effects.
Yeah.
But the psychological effects were what really stood out.
Because they just couldn't stop thinking about food.
Exactly. They started collecting recipes, they obsessed over cookbooks, they talked about meals constantly. Their minds were entirely hijacked by the caloric deficit.
And that biological hijacking applies to abstract concepts too, right? Not just food.
It applies universally to whatever the perceived deficit is.
Wow.
Like if you are profoundly lonely, your cognitive background process is constantly scanning for social connection. You're analyzing facial expressions, hyperfixating on perceived slights.
Because your brain is starving for connection.
Right. If you're broke, you fixate on the cost of literally everything around you. If you're chronically overworked, your mind is consumed by the ticking clock.
So scarcity captures your attention at the subconscious level.
Exactly. It alters how you weigh choices and interact with the world long before your conscious mind even registers that a decision is being made.
Now, to be fair to the human brain, there actually is an evolutionary benefit to this mechanism, right? Like, it isn't entirely destructive, at least not at first. The sources highlight something they call the focus dividend.
Yeah, the focus dividend is essentially the short-term superpower granted by that involuntary mental capture.
A superpower. I like that.
Think about how you operate when a massive deadline is looming. The British journalist Max Hastings once noted about Winston Churchill that an Englishman's mind works best when it is almost too late.
Oh man, I think anyone who has ever pulled an all-nighter in college or rushed a quarterly report feels that in their bones.
Totally. The impending deadline creates an artificial acute scarcity of time. And because your mind is captured by that scarcity, you stop procrastinating.
You don't linger at the coffee machine.
Right. You don't get distracted by tangential emails. You become ruthlessly efficient, hyper-productive, and entirely focused on the immediate task. Your brain marshals all this resources to resolve the deficit.
And the researchers actually managed to isolate and measure this focus dividend in a laboratory setting, right? Using a really clever methodology.
Oh, this is one of my favorite studies. They brought in psychologist Anuj Shah to set up an experiment using a video game called Angry Blueberries.
Which is basically just a stripped-down clone of Angry Birds.
Exactly. They brought subjects into the lab and randomly assigned them to experience either abundance or scarcity within the context of this game.
Okay.
So the players in the rich group were given a massive stockpile of shots, like a ton of blueberries to fling at the targets per round. The players in the poor group were given very few.
So they created a perfectly controlled environment to observe how resource allocation changes behavior.
Exactly.
What I find so fascinating about the results is that the poor players actually performed better on a per-shot basis.
They did.
Because they only had like 3 or 4 blueberries to clear the board, they spent significantly more time analyzing the physics of the puzzle. They adjusted their angles meticulously.
They couldn't afford to waste a single shot.
Right. They were forced by their artificial poverty to extract the absolute maximum amount of value out of every single resource they had, whereas the rich players just rapidly fired their blueberries without much thought because, well, they could afford to miss.
That is the focus dividend functioning exactly as intended. Scarcity forces an optimization of the immediate resource.
It makes me think of the mechanics of packing a suitcase.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
If you're going on a 2-week vacation and you bring one of those massive, oversized checked bags, you pack under a mindset of total abundance.
You just throw everything in.
Right. You throw in 3 pairs of shoes you probably won't wear, 4 extra sweaters just in case the weather turns, a couple of books you definitely won't read. You don't think about spatial efficiency because you literally don't have to.
You have the space.
But if you're flying on a budget airline for a weekend trip and they restrict you to a single, tiny, strictly measured carry-on bag,
Oh, your entire mindset shifts.
suddenly you become an absolute master of spatial geometry. You are rolling your socks and stuffing them inside your shoes to save cubic inches.
Yeah, holding 2 shirts up and ruthlessly calculating the warmth to volume ratio.
Exactly. You are extracting maximum utility from a heavily constrained space.
So the carry-on bag forces the focus dividend. But the crucial turning point in the research is realizing what happens to everything else while you are hyper-focused on the suitcase.
Right.
Every cognitive mechanism has a trade-off. If the front of this coin is the focus dividend, the back of the coin is a devastating phenomenon the researchers call the tunneling tax.
The tunneling tax.
Yeah.
Because to focus intently on one thing inherently requires you to ignore everything else.
Exactly.
Susan Sontag said it beautifully about photography. She said, to photograph is to frame, and to frame is to exclude.
Oh, that is perfect.
Yes.
Scarcity does precisely that to our cognition. It builds a tunnel.
Okay, unpack the tunnel for us.
Well, we focus with laser precision on managing the immediate burning scarcity at hand, like the impending project deadline or the rent check that is going to bounce tomorrow.
Yeah.
But the walls of that tunnel block out our peripheral vision completely.
We become functionally blind to anything that isn't the immediate crisis.
Blind is the right word. And this blindness isn't just a metaphor for being, a little distracted. We are talking about a measurable physical degradation of our brain's computational capacity.
The sources use the umbrella term bandwidth to describe this.
Yeah, bandwidth. And it encompasses 2 critical pillars of human cognition. First is fluid intelligence, which is your raw ability to process new information, recognize patterns, and solve novel problems on the fly.
And the second.
Second is executive control, which is the system responsible for self-regulation, resisting impulses, and projecting consequences into the future.
Okay, so when scarcity captures your mind,
It essentially opens a massive, unclosable application in your brain's operating system that drains both of those resources continuously.
anyone who has ever tried to render a heavy video file on an old laptop knows this exact pain.
Oh, yeah.
The fans start screaming, and you just try to open a simple text document, but there's a 3-second delay on every single keystroke because your RAM is completely monopolized by the background process.
That analogy is neurologically accurate. The background process of worrying about scarcity literally eats up your cognitive RAM.
And the researchers actually quantified this drop in capacity, didn't they?
They did. They found that experiencing severe scarcity, whether that is the financial terror of poverty or the extreme pressure of severe time scarcity, reduces a person's functional cognitive capacity more than going an entire night without sleep.
Wow. We really need to let the weight of that sink in. Being poor or being trapped in a cycle of chronic overwork causes a temporary drop in IQ that is more severe than absolute sleep deprivation.
It is a profound finding because it completely reframes how we judge human behavior.
Right, because we tend to judge people for making bad decisions when they're under pressure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this data proves that people dealing with scarcity do not inherently have less bandwidth. The experience of scarcity taxes the bandwidth of whoever is experiencing it.
So if my mind is constantly looping on the panic of how to pay next week's utility bill,
You literally have less processing power available to dedicate to, say, helping your child with their homework, or evaluating a new job opportunity, or even remembering to take your medication.
you become more impulsive, highly prone to errors,
And your long-term planning just shuts down.
because your brain is entirely occupied with managing the crisis inside the tunnel. Which brings us back to the suitcase analogy and introduces, I think, the most important variable in this entire discussion, the concept of slack.
Yes, slack is the key.
Because when I pack my giant oversized suitcase with abundance, I invariably leave some empty space. The clothes shift around, it isn't perfectly optimized. That empty, unoptimized space is slack.
Slack is the buffer. It is the portion of your resource, whether that's time, money, or cognitive bandwidth, that remains completely untapped simply because you are operating under a mindset of abundance.
You didn't need to optimize every inch.
Right, so you left room to breathe.
And the sources outline this brilliant financial scenario to explain why this buffer is literally a matter of survival. Let's look at two guys, Alex and Ben. Alex makes a very comfortable 6-figure salary. Ben is working an hourly wage and living paycheck to paycheck. They both go to the mall on a Saturday. They both walk past a boutique. And they both succumb to the exact same irrational impulse. They buy a $200 neon leather jacket that they will absolutely never wear.
A completely universal mistake. We've all been there.
Right. It's a terrible decision. They bring it home, hang it in the closet, and the buyer's remorse sets in. Now, mechanically, how does Alex, the wealthy guy, absorb the cost of that mistake?
He absorbs it with his slack. Because Alex operates in a state of financial abundance, his monthly expenses weren't pushed right up against the absolute limit of his income. He had empty space in his financial suitcase.
So the $200 just vaporizes into the buffer.
Exactly. He doesn't have to cancel a vacation. He doesn't have to skip a meal. The mistake costs him $200 on paper, but it costs him absolutely nothing in terms of his actual day-to-day lifestyle or well-being.
But for Ben, who is living in the tunnel with zero slack.
For Ben, every single dollar of his income is already rigidly assigned to an essential survival function. He has no empty space. So when he makes the exact same $200 mistake, that money must be violently extracted from somewhere else.
Like his rent.
It comes out of his rent allocation or his grocery budget for the next 2 weeks. Because he lacks slack, a simple error in judgment cascades into a genuine crisis.
So slack isn't just empty space, it's a shock absorber for reality.
I love that phrase. The economist Abhijit Banerjee refers to this phenomenon as the temptation tax, and he points out how incredibly regressive it is.
Oh, so?
Well, dipping into temptation or making a minor calculation error is a universal human trait. We all do it. But the penalty for that error is proportionally catastrophic for the person operating without slack.
Ah, I see.
Slack provides the hidden efficiency of forgiveness. It gives you room to maneuver, room to reshuffle the board when you inevitably mess up, and room to handle unexpected shocks.
Okay, I have to step in here and put on my corporate MBA hat for a minute. Because if I take everything you are calling slack and put it in front of a modern efficiency consultant, they're going to call it waste.
Oh, absolutely they will.
I mean, we were relentlessly trained to eliminate waste, trim the fat, optimize the supply chain. If I have a corporate suitcase with empty space in it, I am paying for volume that isn't generating shareholder value.
Right.
So isn't advocating for slack just providing an intellectual excuse for laziness and operational inefficiency?
That is the exact counter-argument you hear in almost every boardroom. And it exposes a dangerous fundamental confusion between two completely distinct concepts: fat and slack.
Okay, distinguish them for me.
Fat is true waste. It's a redundant process, an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy, a resource that consumes energy but provides absolutely zero value to the system. You should cut fat.
But slack is different.
Entirely different. Slack is the structural buffer that allows a complex system to survive friction. If you eliminate slack, you make the system incredibly brittle. Traffic engineers actually model this perfectly. The mathematics of fluid dynamics on a highway dictate that traffic flows most efficiently when the road is operating below 70% of its total spatial capacity.
Below 70%, because if there's a generous cushion of empty space between every car, everyone can comfortably travel at the speed limit.
Exactly. But imagine an efficiency consultant looks at that highway and says, look at all that wasted asphalt between the cars. We are only utilizing 70% of our asset. Let's optimize it.
Oh boy.
So they pack the highway to 100% capacity, bumper to bumper, moving at 60 miles an hour. What happens the moment reality introduces a slight friction?
One driver taps their brakes because they saw a squirrel, and the whole system explodes.
Yes. Without the slack to absorb the deceleration of that one car, the shockwave violently ripples backward. The car behind slams on its brakes, the next one stops completely, and within seconds, your 100% efficient highway is a paralyzed parking lot.
Wow. So when you strip all the slack out of your daily schedule, or you run a supply chain with zero buffer inventory, you aren't actually creating efficiency.
Not at all. You are destroying the system's ability to absorb the inevitable shocks of a chaotic world. You think you're trimming the fat, but you're actually cutting the structural integrity of the bridge.
And when you push a human being or an organization into a state of zero slack, you force them directly into the cognitive tunnel of scarcity.
Exactly. Their bandwidth drops, their fluid intelligence plummets, they lose executive control.
And they start making decisions that look completely irrational from the outside, but make perfect sense if you're trapped inside the tunnel.
Which is the mechanism that creates the perpetual trap. Scarcity begets tunneling, tunneling reduces bandwidth, reduced bandwidth leads to errors, and errors create more scarcity.
It's a vicious cycle. Let's take this theoretical framework and watch it operate in the real world because it plays out with devastating systemic consequences.
Let's do it.
I want to transition to the field research from Poor Economics and look at the informal markets in South Asia, specifically the fruit vendors operating on the streets of Chennai, India.
This is one of the most powerful empirical demonstrations of the scarcity trap ever documented. The researchers spent time observing these local fruit vendors. We're talking about incredibly hardworking women.
Oh, absolutely.
They wake up long before dawn, travel to the wholesale markets, negotiate for produce, and then stand in the grueling heat selling fruit to passersby for 12 to 14 hours a day.
And when you break down the financial architecture of their daily existence, it really defies belief. Let's walk through the mechanics of the math here, because understanding the numbers is vital to understanding the psychological trap.
Let's hear the numbers.
Okay, so a vendor wakes up and goes to the wholesaler. To buy enough fruit to stock her cart for the day, she needs 1,000 rupees. In terms of local purchasing power, that's roughly equivalent to about $50 US.
But she doesn't have 1,000 rupees in savings. She operates with zero financial slack. So she has to borrow the capital from the wholesaler or a local moneylender right then and there at the start of the day.
She borrows the 1,000 rupees, she takes her fruit, works her stall all day, generates her revenue, and at night, she goes back to the lender to settle the account. She repays the 1,000 rupee principal plus interest, handing over exactly 1,046.9 rupees.
Which means the interest she is paying on that loan is 4.69%.
Per day. Not per year, per day.
To truly conceptualize how predatory that is, if you were to take a $5 loan at a 4.69% daily compounding interest rate and you let it roll over for a single calendar year.
The math is staggering. That $5 loan compounds into a $90 million bet.
$90 million.
That is the cost of the capital these women rely on just to maintain their baseline existence.
And here is where the aha moment of the research hits, connecting directly back to our discussion on bandwidth. The economists looked at the vendors' daily profit margins and calculated a way out. They realized that if a vendor could somehow manage to save just 5 rupees a day out of her profits,
which, in the local economy, is roughly the cost of a single cup of tea.
literally just foregoing 1 cup of tea a day. If she could save those 5 rupees consistently, the math dictates that within 30 days, she would accumulate enough capital to buy her daily wholesale fruit outright.
She'd be free.
She would no longer need the moneylender. She would be completely, permanently debt-free.
And because she's no longer surrendering that 4.69% interest every single night, her actual take-home income would literally double overnight for the rest of her natural life.
Think about that. If a Western government introduced a social program that guaranteed to double a citizen's lifetime income after just 30 days of minor inconvenience, it would be hailed as an unprecedented miracle of economics.
Without a doubt.
Yet every single vendor in Chennai has access to this miraculous program right now, simply by saving 5 rupees. But the tragedy observed by the researchers is that they don't do it. The typical vendor in their study hadn't just been doing this for a few weeks. Many had been borrowing on these exact terms for nearly 10 years.
Wow. So if I'm sitting comfortably in my house, operating with plenty of abundance and slack, my immediate instinct is to judge.
Of course it is.
I look at those numbers and say, well, the math is obvious. She must just lack basic financial literacy. Or maybe she just lacks the willpower and discipline to skip the cup of tea.
Which is the fundamental attribution error that plagues almost all policymaking.
Right.
We look at the computer grinding to a halt because its RAM is maxed out by background processes, and we assume the processor itself is permanently broken.
Oh, that's such a good way to put it.
The vendor is not failing to save 5 rupees because she lacks intelligence, and she certainly doesn't lack a work ethic. She is failing to save it because she is completely trapped inside the cognitive tunnel of scarcity.
Her entire mental bandwidth is consumed by the sheer friction of surviving today.
Exactly that. Think about the bandwidth tax we discussed. Navigating life on the razor's edge of extreme poverty requires a staggering, relentless amount of cognitive effort.
You're constantly juggling shifting crises.
Right. You are managing micro cash flows, worrying about local corruption, dealing with health issues without a safety net. Her executive control is being depleted every single second of the day.
So by the end of the day,
By the time the evening rolls around, and she has to make the conscious choice to resist the immediate comfort of a cup of tea and intellectually project the mathematical benefit of that sacrifice 30 days into the future, her mental RAM is exhausted.
she just can't do it.
She simply does not have the computational bandwidth left to execute the plan. She lacks the mental slack to envision day 31, because day 1 is taking everything she has.
The scarcity itself has engineered the slack completely out of her mind.
Yeah.
So if the cognitive trap is keeping her stuck, the next logical question is a structural one. Why doesn't a traditional commercial bank step in and disrupt this market? I mean, if the local moneylender is making a killing at nearly 5% a day, a formal bank could sweep into Chennai, offer these vendors a loan at 1% a day, completely undercut the local sharks, and still make an absolute fortune.
It seems like a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
But the invisible barrier keeping formal banks out isn't a lack of desire for profit. It comes down to a concept in economics known as the administrative cost of information.
Information costs. How does that stop a loan?
Well, for any formal financial institution to lend money, they need reliable information to determine if you are a good credit risk. In the developed world, that infrastructure is ubiquitous and cheap.
Right, we have centralized credit scores, property deeds, W-2 tax forms.
Verifiable banking histories. A loan officer can pull your digital file in 3 seconds and know with statistical certainty how likely you are to repay. But how do you assess the creditworthiness of a fruit vendor operating an unregistered cart in an informal street market in Chennai?
There's no digital footprint, there's no W-2.
Exactly. To get that information, the bank would have to physically send a human being out into the streets.
They'd have to pay a salary to a loan officer to wander the market, locate the vendor, verify her identity, assess the daily revenue of her fruit cart, and then track her down every single evening to collect a repayment.
And the sheer administrative cost of gathering that information and enforcing the contract on a $50 loan is massively higher than any profit the bank could ever hope to extract, even at high interest rates.
Which means the formal banking sector is fundamentally incompatible with the extreme poor, leaving them entirely at the mercy of the informal market, the local moneylenders.
And informal markets are able to operate profitably because they rely on mechanisms completely alien to formal banking. They rely on custom and something the sources define as selective trust.
Selective trust.
The local money lender doesn't need to pay for a credit score because he lives in the neighborhood. He already knows the vendor's family history. He knows exactly which corner she sets up her cart on every morning. The information cost for him is zero.
He has the information, but he also has an entirely different method of enforcement. He has leverage.
Crucial leverage.
Yeah.
As poor economics details, people in extreme poverty are often driven to borrow from figures who possess the capacity to genuinely hurt them, whether that is socially isolating them or through the threat of actual physical violence if they default on the loan.
Wow.
The authors note the historical precedent in Calcutta, where moneylenders were often Kabulis large, imposing men from Afghanistan.
I read about that.
The sheer physical intimidation of their presence was enough to ensure compliance. The terrifying threat of severe, immediate consequences acts as the binding contract, eliminating the need for expensive legal enforcement.
It's a completely brutal reality. The poorest people are paying the highest rates, enforced by the most aggressive means, simply because they are invisible to formal systems. But this is exactly why microfinance was heralded as the ultimate savior. Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize, the rise of the Grameen Bank. The utopian vision was that a microfinance institution, an MFI, steps in, acts ethically, doesn't exploit the borrower, and offers reasonable rates.
Right.
But how do MFIs bypass that information cost problem without resorting to sending large guys to intimidate people?
The genius of the original microfinance model is that it found a way to outsource the information gathering and the enforcement directly to the community itself.
Oh, that's clever.
They heavily leverage existing social networks and the powerful psychological threat of shame. The vast majority of MFIs do not lend to individuals. They operate on a group lending model.
The group lending.
They lend to usually a small group of women from the same village or neighborhood. And the critical catch is joint liability. If one single woman in the group defaults on her weekly payment, the entire group is permanently cut off from any future access to credit.
Oh, that completely flips the dynamic.
Right.
The MFI doesn't need to know who is a credit risk because the local women already know.
Exactly. The community possesses the localized information the bank lacks. The women self-select. They won't let someone into their borrowing group if they know she is unreliable or a heavy drinker. They curate the risk pool themselves.
Because their own access to capital is on the line.
Right. And more importantly, they police each other's behavior relentlessly. Furthermore, the MFI loan officers utilize the threat of public social shame as their enforcement mechanism.
Social shame.
The researchers recount an interview with a woman in Hyderabad who admitted she would routinely skip meals just to make her weekly microfinance payment. Not out of fear of violence, but because she couldn't bear the thought of the credit officer coming to her door and making a nuisance in front of all her neighbors.
So it isn't physical violence, but it is intense, localized social pressure. The fear of being ostracized ensures compliance.
And purely from a metric of repayment, it is wildly successful. Default rates in traditional microfinance are famously, almost unbelievably low, often hovering under 3 or 4%. It has successfully deployed capital to millions of people who were previously unbanked.
But the sources bring up a very sobering reality check about microfinance. Despite the hype, despite the Nobel Prizes and the near-perfect repayment rates, it hasn't actually delivered on the utopian promise of eradicating global poverty.
No, it hasn't.
It hasn't turned millions of street vendors into thriving middle-class entrepreneurs.
It absolutely hasn't.
Yeah.
To understand why, we have to look past the loan itself and examine the systemic structure of the microbusinesses the poor are actually running.
Okay.
The data reveals a hard truth. While small microloans are incredibly effective at smoothing out consumption, meaning they help a family survive a temporary shock like a medical emergency without having to sell their roof, they rarely trigger explosive, transformative business growth.
Why not, though? If the vendor finally gets access to capital at a non-predatory rate, why doesn't she grow the business?
Because of the underlying physics of the return on investment in these informal sectors, the economists describe the growth trajectory not as a straight line, but as an S-curve.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of the S-curve. Imagine trying to roll a heavy boulder out of a deep ditch.
That is a perfect mechanical analogy. At the bottom of the ditch, the bottom tail of the S, You apply a little bit of energy, a small investment, and the boulder rolls a few feet up the slope.
You make a tiny bit of progress.
But the slope is shallow. The returns are low. And if you stop pushing, the boulder just rolls right back down to where it started.
Right. To actually get out of the ditch, you have to hit the steep part of the wall, the middle of the S.
Exactly. And to push the boulder up that steep vertical section, you can't just use a series of tiny pushes. You need a massive, sustained influx of energy all at once to crest the lip of the ditch.
A big push.
Once you get over that hump, you hit the top of the S, the flat ground, and the boulder rolls forward easily on its own. In business terms, that massive push is the capital required to buy heavy machinery, sign a lease on a storefront, or hire full-time employees.
So once you cross that threshold, your returns skyrocket and scale exponentially.
But the structural flaw with MFIs is that they are structurally incapable of providing that massive push.
Because the loans are too small.
Precisely. Because MFIs are highly risk-averse and rely on the delicate balance of social pressure to ensure repayment, they purposely keep their loan amounts incredibly small. They might give a fruit vendor a $100 loan.
Right.
That $100 is a small push. It allows her to buy slightly more fruit to sell today. It keeps her busy at the bottom of the S-curve, moving the boulder a few feet up the shallow slope. But it is nowhere near the thousands of dollars she would need to buy a refrigerated delivery truck and cross the hump. She hits an invisible ceiling of scale.
She remains fundamentally too poor to absorb the risk of a major investment, so she never hits the steep part of the curve. And the rigid structure of the MFI loans enforces this, right? If you have to make a payment every single week starting on day 7, you can't use that money to invest in a crop that takes 6 months to harvest. You are forced to stick to whatever generates immediate daily cash flow just to service the debt.
They are forced to play it safe, which guarantees they stay small. But the sources do highlight incredible exceptions that prove the rule. The most illuminating example is the story of the trash sorter in Guntur.
Yes, this story is phenomenal because it perfectly illustrates what happens when you alter the system to create slack.
This woman started at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. She was a trash collector, wandering the streets gathering scrap to sell by the kilo.
Grueling work.
Eventually, she gained access to a microfinance loan. But here is the critical deviation. Instead of using the loan to simply buy more trash bags and do more of the same grueling work, she used the MFI capital to pay off a massive, crippling, high-interest debt she owed to a local moneylender.
So the loan didn't expand her business directly. It functioned as debt consolidation.
It bought out her bad debt. And by eliminating that predatory daily interest payment, the MFI loan did something much more valuable than providing capital. It provided breathing space.
Slack.
It injected slack into her cognitive ecosystem. For the very first time in her life, her mental bandwidth wasn't entirely consumed by the sheer terror of facing the moneylender that evening.
The tunnel walls came down.
With that newly reclaimed mental slack, she finally had the bandwidth to look at the broader system she was operating within. She looked past her daily survival and observed that the middlemen she was selling her raw scrap to were making a massive profit margin simply by sorting the trash, separating the valuable metals from the plastics and organic waste.
She realized the value wasn't in collecting. The value was in processing.
She used her subsequent loans and the savings generated by her new slack to buy a pushcart. She and her husband stopped walking the streets and started buying raw trash from other collectors, bringing it home and sorting it themselves, capturing that massive middleman margin. Their income jumped significantly. As they built more slack, they expanded again. By the time The Economist interviewed her, she was running a large-scale network of trash collectors. She had successfully pushed her boulder over the hump of the S-curve.
But the absolute most crucial takeaway from her story is that she didn't cross the hump simply because she was handed money.
No.
She crossed it because the initial influx of capital created a temporary pocket of cognitive slack. That slack gave her the fluid intelligence and executive control required to step back, analyze the system, and redesign her strategy. It allowed her to stop surviving the system and start manipulating it.
Which serves as the perfect conceptual bridge to the macro level of our discussion.
Yes, let's pull the camera all the way back. Because if a single fruit vendor or a trash sorter can be paralyzed by a lack of slack, what happens when an entire complex organization or a massive multinational corporation operates under the exact same zero slack philosophy?
It's messy.
Let's dive into the systems dynamics mapped out in Thinking in Systems and the fifth discipline.
When we elevate this from the individual brain to the organizational level, The sheer scale of the consequences gets much larger, but the underlying mechanical failures are remarkably similar.
Oh, so.
To understand why organizations trap themselves, we have to look at how humans naturally perceive reality. As Donella Meadows points out in Thinking in Systems, the human mind has evolved to focus on snapshots. We are incredibly good at looking at what she calls stocks, the accumulation of a resource at a specific moment in time.
We look at the dashboard. The snapshot is, what is the exact balance in the corporate bank account today? Or how many widgets did the sales team move in Q3?
Those are stocks. But complex systems do not operate as a series of isolated snapshots. Systems operate continuously in patterns and flows, the rates at which things change and interact over time, driven by interconnected feedback loops. And the most dangerous, destabilizing element of any feedback loop in a complex system is the presence of delays.
Delays between cause and effect. Okay, let's mechanize this. How do delayed feedback loops destroy an organization that has stripped out all of its slack?
The most relatable mechanical analogy is trying to adjust the water temperature in an old hotel shower, where there is a 10-second delay between you turning the knob and the water actually changing temperature at the shower head.
Oh man, we've all lived this nightmare. You step in and the water is freezing cold.
Because your brain operates in snapshots, you react to the immediate state. The water's cold right now. So you crank the hot water valve all the way open. But because of the delay in the plumbing system, the water hitting your back remains freezing cold for the next 5 seconds.
So my snapshot brain assumes the input wasn't enough, and I crank the valve even harder.
And then, 10 seconds later, the massive slug of hot water you unleashed finally arrives, and you are suddenly being scalded.
Panic sets in, and I violently crank the valve all the way back to cold.
And 10 seconds later, you are freezing again. You are locked in a vicious cycle of wildly overshooting and undershooting your desired target.
That is so frustrating.
Now, take that exact same behavioral mechanism and apply it to a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. The sources utilize the construction of electric power plants as a prime example of this failure. The delay in building a power plant is enormous.
Like years.
It can take up to 10 years from the initial planning stages to the day the plant actually starts generating electricity, and then the plant is expected to operate for 40 years.
That is a staggering delay between the decision and the result.
Now imagine the energy industry is operating with zero slack. They have no excess power generation capacity, no buffer. Suddenly, there's an economic boom, and the immediate snapshot says, we are desperately short on power right now. Blackouts are looming.
Right, panic mode.
Because they have no slack to absorb the surge in demand, the industry panics. They aggressively initiate the construction of 20 new power plants all at once.
But the power doesn't arrive today. The delay kicks in.
10 years pass. During those 10 years, the economy might cool down, or new energy efficiencies might be adopted. But suddenly, all 20 power plants come online simultaneously.
Oh no.
The market is flooded with a massive overcapacity of electricity, prices crash. The industry realizes they severely overshot the target.
So they violently crank the valve the other way? They cancel all future construction projects?
It built nothing for the next decade. As old plants retire and demand slowly creeps up, they eventually hit a critical shortage again. They undershoot, and the cycle repeats.
So an organization or an industry simply cannot respond smoothly to short-term fluctuations when it is governed by long-term delays.
Not unless it maintains a substantial cushion of slack to absorb the noise while waiting for the feedback loop to complete.
But I want to introduce a counter-argument from another one of our sources here. In Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Richard Rumelt leans heavily on the concept of entropy. In the realm of physics, entropy is the second law of thermodynamics. It is the universal tendency of any closed physical system to naturally degrade from order into chaos and disorder over time.
Right.
Rumelt makes the compelling case that this exact same force applies to business. Organizations do not naturally become more efficient. Left to their own devices, they become messy, bloated, and unfocused.
Entropy is an undeniable, persistent force in any organizational structure.
So if an organization is constantly, naturally trying to pull itself apart into chaos, doesn't a CEO have a fundamental duty to impose strict zero-slack rules? Don't you need rigid, top-down, authoritarian control to fight the gravity of entropy and keep everyone marching in a straight line?
It is a totally understandable leadership instinct. When you see chaos, you want to impose order. But from a systems dynamics perspective, attempting to eradicate entropy through rigid, zero-slack control is a fatal long-term error.
Why is it an error?
When a CEO tries to micromanage every variable and strip out all the buffer space, they inadvertently destroy the system's ability to engage in self-organization.
Self-organization, meaning the system has the capacity to evolve and adapt on its own without centralized command.
Precisely. Self-organization is the hallmark of any resilient, complex system. It is the ability to generate new structures, learn from the environment, diversify, and innovate.
Like the human brain.
The human brain is a self-organizing system. A rainforest ecosystem self-organizes. But for a system to self-organize, it requires freedom of movement. It requires experimentation. And crucially, it requires a certain baseline level of disorder and redundancy.
Which is the exact opposite of what a control-freak CEO wants. Disorder terrifies traditional management.
It deeply threatens traditional hierarchical power structures. If you demand 100% utilization, perfect compliance, and zero slack, you might temporarily halt the visible signs of entropy. You might make the spreadsheet look perfect for a few quarters. But you completely paralyze the creative evolutionary power of the system. You turn your vibrant organization into a brittle, deterministic machine that can only execute what it is currently doing. The moment the external environment changes, a new competitor emerges, or technology shifts, the machine cannot adapt, and it shatters.
Which brings us to the ultimate question for leaders. What are the tangible historical consequences for the CEOs and managers who buy into the lean and mean fallacy, who believe that cutting slack is the path to greatness?
The ultimate consequence is that they completely bankrupt their organization's future cognitive bandwidth in order to artificially maximize today's operational efficiency.
We have historical precedent for how this plays out.
We do. Look at the massive wave of leveraged buyouts in the 1980s. The prevailing financial logic of the era was that legacy corporations had become fat, lazy, and complacent.
So the strategy was to buy them out, saddle them with immense amounts of debt,
And force them from a state of abundance into a state of acute financial scarcity to enforce discipline.
because they knew scarcity forces the focus dividend. It forces the managers to finally pay attention and cut the waste.
And in the short term, it worked. It created intense focus. Managers scrutinized every single line item and eliminated redundancies. But the tragic flaw, as the authors of Scarcity point out, is that they lack the vocabulary to distinguish between fat and slack.
So they cut both.
They cut both. They eliminated the waste, but they also sold off the buffer inventory. They fired the R&D departments, and they eliminated the emergency cash reserves.
Ouch.
The managers became hypervigilant, but they're operating inside the tunnel. With no room to maneuver, the slightest macroeconomic shock, a dip in consumer demand, a spike in raw material costs pushed them straight to the brink of bankruptcy. To survive the debt payments today, they began cannibalizing the assets needed to survive tomorrow.
We see this tunneling behavior manifesting in incredibly dangerous ways outside of finance, too. The sources highlight a chilling example of managerial failure at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab.
The JPL case study is a masterclass in misunderstanding the difference between time and bandwidth. The JPL team was working on the Mars Orbiter mission, an incredibly complex, high-stakes project.
Right.
As development progressed, they realized they were falling behind schedule. And unlike a corporate product launch, you cannot push a Mars launch back a month. You are governed by the unchangeable deadlines of orbital mechanics and planetary alignment.
It is the ultimate non-negotiable hard deadline.
Yeah.
You can't ask Mars to wait.
So faced with the scarcity of time, what did the management team do? They executed the standard operating procedure for zero slack management. They threw more hours at the problem. They demanded the engineers work longer shifts, weekends, nights.
They saw a deficit in time, so they forcefully deployed more time.
But they completely ignored the deficit in bandwidth.
Exactly. By forcing the engineers to work 70 or 80 hours a week, they thoroughly depleted the cognitive capacity of the team.
The engineers were physically present, but their fluid intelligence was compromised. Their executive control was shot. They were exhausted, operating deep inside the scarcity tunnel.
And what happened?
They began making fundamental errors in calculations. Management was pouring more raw hours into the project, but they were extracting significantly less actual bandwidth and intellectual rigor.
It's the human equivalent of the laptop RAM problem. The managers thought they could make the computer process the video faster by opening up 20 more tabs and hitting refresh. They just crashed the human operating system.
Yeah.
And when the zero slack mindset is applied to critical infrastructure, it costs lives. The sources cite a terrifying example regarding St. John's Hospital.
St. John's Hospital serves as the perfect, tragic illustration of how efficiency algorithms destroy complex systems. The hospital administration brought in consultants to maximize the utilization of their most expensive asset, the operating rooms. They viewed any empty RR time as unacceptable waste. So they optimized the schedule, booking elective surgeries back-to-back, filling the OR capacity to 100%.
Which looks fantastic on a quarterly efficiency report. Maximum throughput.
But an emergency room is not a predictable factory assembly line. It is a highly volatile, complex system. What happens when a severe trauma case, a multi-car pileup, comes through the doors and needs an operating room instantly to save a life?
They have to bump one of the scheduled non-emergency surgeries.
Yes, they bump a scheduled surgery. But because the system was engineered with absolute zero slack, bumping that one surgery doesn't just delay one patient, it triggers a cascading systemic failure.
The highway analogy again.
Exactly. It throws the entire hospital schedule for the rest of the day and often the week into complete chaos. Surgeons are left standing around waiting for rooms. Nurses are frantically scrambling to reorganize triage. Patients who have been fasting for 12 hours are delayed endlessly.
The friction just explodes.
The sheer administrative friction generated by attempting to manage the overflow consumes massive amounts of staff bandwidth. By trying to eliminate the waste of an empty room, they engineered a system where the slightest unpredictable glitch imposes a massive, paralyzing tax on the entire hospital.
Because they treated slack as a bug when it is actually the core features of resilience. And this realization brings us to the profound theoretical shift proposed by Peter Senge in the fifth discipline. He argues that if an organization wants to survive long-term, it has to undergo something he calls metanoia.
Metanoia is a Greek word that translates to a fundamental shift of mind, or a profound transformation of perspective. Senge argues that companies must transition away from being traditional, authoritarian command and control structures and evolve into learning organizations.
A learning organization. Unpack the mechanics of that. How does a company actually learn?
Senge makes a vital distinction between two different modes of organizational learning. The first is adaptive learning. Adaptive learning is purely about survival. It is firefighting.
Give me an example.
It is figuring out how to reorganize the schedule today to handle the trauma patient. It is the fruit vendor figuring out how to scrape together enough cash to pay the moneylender tonight.
It's learning how to survive the tunnel.
Yes. Adaptive learning is necessary to keep the lights on, but it is not sufficient for long-term growth. A true learning organization must couple adaptive learning with generative learning.
Generative learning.
Generative learning is the capacity to step outside the tunnel, question the underlying assumptions of the system itself, and create entirely new paradigms and futures.
But here is the brutal catch, tying everything we've discussed together. You cannot possibly engage in generative learning if your organization has zero slack.
It is structurally impossible. When a workforce is packed to 100% capacity, everyone is trapped in the cognitive tunnel of scarcity. They are functionally blinded.
Right.
And when highly intelligent people are trapped in that state of stress, they fall prey to a toxic organizational dynamic that Harvard researcher Chris Argyris calls skilled incompetence and defensive routines.
Oh. Skilled incompetence is such a brilliantly devastating phrase. How do smart people become skillfully incompetent?
Argyris observed that modern corporate culture and our educational system at large intensely trains individuals to always have the right answer, to project certainty, and to view admitting ignorance as a fatal career weakness.
Especially in a zero-slack environment where any delay or uncertainty is punished because the schedule is so tight.
Exactly. So when these teams of brilliant people are confronted with a truly complex systemic problem, a problem where the root cause is murky, or where the solution might require admitting a past failure, their ability to function as a team completely disintegrates.
They freeze up.
They deploy defensive routines to protect their egos and their status from the pain of appearing incompetent. They actively avoid inquiring deeply into the complex reality of the situation. Instead, they hide behind simple, linear, aggressive solutions that sound confident in a meeting but solve absolutely nothing.
Profits are down. Fire the bottom 10% of the sales team. Product development is too slow. Make the engineers work weekends.
Yes. Senge classifies this behavior under a systems archetype he calls shifting the burden. Because the team lacks the cognitive bandwidth and the time to investigate the fundamental systemic root cause of a problem, they frantically apply a symptomatic fix.
Just a Band-Aid.
It's like taking a painkiller for a broken arm. It temporarily relieves the immediate pressure, which makes everyone feel productive, but it leaves the underlying fracture completely untouched. Over time, the organization becomes addicted to the symptomatic fixes, and the fundamental capacity of the system steadily rots away.
Okay, so how do we break the cycle? If we recognize that zero slack causes tunneling, tunneling causes skilled incompetence, and skilled incompetence destroys the company, how do we actually foster generative learning? The sources bring in Tim Brown's Change by Design, which gives us a practical roadmap out of the trap through design thinking.
Design thinking is the ultimate operational antidote to the purely analytical zero-slack mindset. Brown argues that true innovation doesn't happen in a linear spreadsheet. It happens in three overlapping spaces: inspiration, ideation, and implementation. And the very first crucial step, inspiration, demands profound, immersive empathy with the end user. You cannot generate empathy by looking at market research data or focus group transcripts. You have to physically get out of the corporate bubble and observe the human experience.
The story of the IDEO designer going undercover in the hospital is the perfect, visceral example of breaking the corporate tunnel vision.
It is legendary in design circles. IDEO was hired to consult with a hospital that wanted to improve its patient experience. But instead of just interviewing the administrators and analyzing the efficiency metrics of the nursing staff, one of the core design team members, Christian Simsarian, decided he needed to experience this system from the outside in.
What did he do?
He faked a foot injury and officially checked himself into the emergency room as a patient.
He literally put on a hospital gown and got on the gurney.
He got on the gurney with a hidden video camera strapped to his head to record his exact perspective. And what he captured wasn't a flaw in medical procedure or a bottleneck in triage. He captured the crushing, dehumanizing tedium of the patient experience. The video was hours of staring at acoustic ceiling tiles, being wheeled backward down anonymous, glaringly bright hallways by staff members who never introduced themselves.
Yeah.
The profound, isolating anxiety of lying in a hallway for hours, not knowing what you're waiting for or who is in charge of your care.
He experienced the hospital's systemic flows from inside the patient's tunnel.
And when he showed that video to the hospital administration, it was a revelation. He exposed that there were two completely conflicting narratives operating simultaneously.
How so?
The hospital staff, who were operating under their own severe scarcity of time and resources, viewed the patient journey purely as a logistical administrative process: insurance verification, bed allocation, clinical triage. But the patient experienced the exact same process as a terrifying, chaotic loss of control.
And the hospital administrators couldn't see that reality because they were too busy being efficient. They had engineered all the slack out of their own days, leaving them with absolutely no bandwidth for empathy.
Precisely. Design thinking forces an organization to build that empathetic slack back into the discovery phase. And once you gather that profound human insight, you move to the ideation and prototyping phases.
Prototyping.
And this is the critical juncture where a zero-slack culture will actively assassinate innovation. Prototyping is not about building a perfect miniature version of a final product. Prototyping is building to think. It is a physical manifestation of a question. And because it is an experiment, it inherently involves a high probability of failure.
Because if you already know for a fact that it's going to work perfectly the first time, it isn't a prototype, it's just manufacturing.
Right. But imagine trying to pitch a prototype in a zero-slack culture. If a CEO has engineered an environment where every single hour must be tied to a billable client, where every project must guarantee a short-term ROI, and where any failure is met with punitive action, employees will simply refuse to prototype.
They won't take the risk.
The psychological resistance is too high. They cannot take the risk. Senge addresses this exact dilemma by calling for the creation of micro-worlds or practice fields.
Practice fields, like a flight simulator for business strategy.
Exactly like a flight simulator. It is a designated safe space, separated from the immediate consequences of the real world, where teams can compress time and space. They can try out radical new strategies, observe the delayed consequences of their systemic decisions, and fail spectacularly without crashing the actual company or ruining their careers.
But to build a flight simulator, you have to take your most valuable pilots offline. You have to pay them to sit in a fake cockpit instead of flying paying customers. It requires dedicating unstructured time to exploration. One of the managers quoted in the research pleaded for this, saying they desperately needed time to play, time to gaze out the window, time to let things settle.
Which sounds completely anathema to the lean and mean philosophy. An efficiency expert would look at someone gazing out a window and fire them on the spot.
Yeah, they would.
But from a cognitive and systemic perspective, that unstructured time is the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for generating the bandwidth required to solve complex problems.
So let me try to synthesize this massive journey we've been on today. If you look at your schedule or you look at the organization you run and you decide to strip out every single ounce of slack in order to maximize today's output, you are operating under a catastrophic illusion.
Really are.
You aren't actually making yourself hyper efficient. You are systematically bankrupting your cognitive bandwidth for tomorrow. You are forcing your brilliant engineers, your talented managers, and yourself directly into the cognitive tunnel of scarcity.
The trap.
You are turning your entire multi-million-dollar corporation into the corporate equivalent of the overworked fruit vendor in Chennai, frantically, exhaustedly juggling immediate crises, surviving day to day, but rendered completely biologically and structurally incapable of seeing the S-curve that could actually revolutionize your industry.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the material. The ultimate lesson here is that knowledge and the strategic application of that knowledge isn't just about moving faster, working harder, or cutting deeper. It is about deliberately constructing the space for reflection and systemic understanding.
The space to breathe.
The true, untouchable strategic advantage in the 21st century isn't hyper-efficiency. It is having the systemic slack required to step back, exit the tunnel, and see the whole board while everyone else is just staring at the pieces.
Which brings us right back to you, the listener, and how you apply this tomorrow morning. Think deeply about the architecture of your own life. When you plan your week, are you just managing your schedule, or are you actually managing your bandwidth?
That's the real question.
Are you packing your daily cognitive suitcase so tightly, scheduling Zoom meetings back-to-back from 8:20:00 to 6:00 p.m. without a single gap, that a minor traffic jam or one delayed email throws your entire psychological state into chaos?
Are you treating yourself like the management team treated the Mars orbiter engineers? When you hit a roadblock, do you just blindly throw more grueling hours at the problem, when what your brain actually requires to solve it is to step away, let the RAM clear, and take a walk?
It requires a profound, unsettling shift in how we evaluate our own worth. We have to stop equating exhaustion with importance. And that leaves me with one final, deeply lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. We've spent this entire deep dive proving that scarcity artificially inflates our focus today, but completely destroys our systemic bandwidth and our capacity for genius tomorrow.
Right.
And yet, right now, look at the ecosystem we live in. We are surrounded by and completely dependent on technologies explicitly designed to optimize every second of our lives.
So true.
Our digital calendars auto-pack our meetings tighter than ever before. Our productivity apps gamify our tasks to ensure we never have a free moment. The AI assistants we are eagerly integrating into our workflows are literally learning how to identify and fill every single idle moment of our day with useful output.
It's all about output.
So the provocative question we have to face is this. Could the very technologies we are enthusiastically using to perfectly optimize our schedules be constructing the ultimate, inescapable scarcity trap? Are we systematically, via algorithms and artificial intelligence, engineering the last remaining bits of slack out of our human experience? And if we succeed in achieving perfect zero-waste efficiency, are we deleting the exact empty space where human genius actually happens?
That is the defining systemic question of our generation.
Something to think about the next time you feel guilty for staring out the window, or the next time you try to cram one more task into an already overflowing day. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning the systems around you, and maybe, just maybe, try leaving a little empty space in your suitcase.